Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We see that we still have a few people joining our webinar, so if you will bear with us, we'll be starting in a few minutes. We'll just be giving people who are still trying to join about 2 minutes. Please bear with us. Thank you. Right, I think that we can get started. Well, good morning again. My name is Sandy Africa, and I'm the Director of Research at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA, and I'm going to be the Program Director today. My role essentially is just to facilitate the speakers introducing their remarks and then facilitating a discussion assisted by a colleague of mine. So I'm going to get started straight away just by saying that this is a really timely and important conversation, and we want to thank you for making time to join us as we talk about traditional leadership in South Africa's democracy as we reflect on 30 years of democracy under our constitution. As many of you will have seen in recent media reports, the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, COGTA, has begun a renewed round of public consultations on legislation relating to traditional leadership and governance. These developments remind us that questions of traditional authority, democracy, governance, land, and constitutionalism remain central to South Africa's democratic journey. The relationship between traditional leadership and constitutional democracy has a long and complex history. It is a history that predates the democratic dispensation and continues to evolve today. It also speaks to broader questions of governance, representation, accountability, social cohesion, and the role of communities within our constitutional framework. So this webinar forms part of MISTRA's long-standing engagement with these issues. Over the years, the Institute has contributed to public debate through research, publications, policy engagement, and dialogue on governance and democracy. Among these contributions are the publication titled Traditional Leaders in a Democracy, Resources, Respect, and Resistance, various presentations, including a presentation by MISTRA's Executive Director at the IEC Northern Cape Thought leadership seminar some time ago, and a working paper commissioned by MISTRA, prepared for parliamentary hearings in 2020 by Professor Lungisile Nsebeza. So today's discussion really builds on an ongoing body of work and reflection, and we are really fortunate to be joined by speakers who bring both academic insight and policy experience to this conversation. I want to mention, as we get started, that this webinar is being live streamed on MISTRA's YouTube channel, MISTRA South Africa, and I can count 128 people having joined us so far. But we really want to allow for your participation, so we encourage you who are online to post your questions for discussion through the Q&A function, the chat function that is. It's open for general participant engagement. We just ask that the engagement is kept respectful and considerate. For those who make use of social media, just like to announce that we'll be posting throughout the webinar on MISTRA's social media platforms, including LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. We ask that you engage with us by tagging us by using our respective hashtags. I won't go into those. I'm sure that you can find them. So with those words of introduction, I would like to proceed to the first part of our program, where we have a welcome and some opening remarks by our Executive Director at MISTRA, Mr. Joel Netshitenze. Over to you, Joel.
Thank you, Sandy. And good morning to all the colleagues who have joined us. I wish to welcome all of you and to acknowledge especially Deputy Minister Andries Nel, who is also a member of the MISTRA board, and all the esteemed presenters. On the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Constitution, South Africa is called upon to reflect on the basics that underpin our democracy. It can be argued that most of the constitutional provisions have been tested and retested through implementation, policy refinement, and astute judicial interpretation. There are, however, a few areas that seem to defy certainty. And two of them stand out, and it is on this account that they form the basis of our webinar today. One of them is the matter of property rights, especially as it applies to land. In the words of then Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke at a conference which was organized by MISTRA in 2014, and I quote him, "In 20 years, the Constitutional Court has not resolved even one case of land expropriation under the property clause. And the courts have never been called upon to give meaning to the property clause in the context of land expropriation, or to decide on what is a just and equitable compensation." He continues, "One would have expected that a matter so pressing as land use, occupation, or ownership would predominate the list of disputes in the post-conflict contestation." Now, the second and related issue, which forms the core theme of today's engagement, pertains to the powers and functions of traditional leaders. And it is an issue that has assumed the character of what we would call a ping-pong ball between lawmakers, the executive, the judiciary, communities, and traditional leaders themselves. The Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act of 2003 seemed to have struck the delicate balance. However, besides the exclusion of Khoisan communities, it suffered from a few weaknesses, including mechanisms of accountability and democratic representation, and the persistent complaint of some communities that the act was largely observed in the breach. Unfortunately, the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act, which was meant to improve on it, did not pass constitutional muster, and according to community and other activists, it did not in any case resolve the core issues. Now, in a book published in 2019, as Dr. Africa has indicated, we sought to address this issue as MISTRA at a conceptual level, with contributions from academics, activists, policymakers, and traditional leaders. The book raised fundamental questions about whether democracy is a threat to traditional leadership or whether traditional leadership is incompatible with democracy. Now, in his contribution in the book, Nkosi Patekile Holomisa challenges the notion of accommodation of traditional leadership in a democracy. He argues, and I quote, "The question from the onset should have been, how shall we accommodate the Western way of governance within the original African forms of governance?" In his chapter, Nkosi Mwelo Nonkonyana says more bluntly that government seems to be playing mind games with traditional leaders, as the necessary reinstatement of the pride and dignity of the institution of traditional leadership in South Africa seems to be perpetually delayed. Now, on the other hand, many have argued, with the concurrence of the courts, that the exercise of traditional leadership cannot override various generations of human rights which are enshrined in our Constitution. In Section 211 and 212, the Constitution acknowledges customary law and recognizes the institution of traditional leadership, of course, within the guardrails of constitutional democracy. However, in the context of the broad spectrum of global monarchical experience, has South Africa in actual practice, rather than theory, found the sweet spot? One is referring here to the following categories in terms of global experience. One, ceremonial monarchies with symbolic powers, such as in Lesotho, the UK, Denmark, and Malaysia. Two, executive monarchies, such as Thailand, Bahrain, and Morocco. And three, absolute monarchies, which exercise all executive power, such as in Eswatini and Saudi Arabia. As in other African countries with diverse nationalities, such as Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Uganda, South Africa has tried to find post-colonial, partially localized expressions of traditional leadership. This applies to local communities, to municipalities, districts, or in the case of KwaZulu-Natal, at provincial level. And it is defined in a manner that does not subtract from the quest for overarching nationhood. In actual practice, South Africa has ceremonial monarchies with provincial and national houses that provide advice. But in communal areas, we also have provisions for executive and judicial functions for the traditional leader. And depending on the nature of traditional councils or the inclination of the traditional leader, some communities experience manifestations of absolute monarchies. The endless ping pong is in part because the elaboration of the roles and responsibilities at subnational level has largely not been undertaken. In addition, it is necessary to develop formal mechanisms through which traditional leaders relate to democratic institutions such as ward, municipal, and district governance structures. In turn, consideration needs to be given to representation of ward councillors and mayors or their representatives in equivalent traditional councils, all to allow for what one would refer to as bidirectional osmosis. It can also be argued that traditional authority should be underpinned by a sense of responsibility and accountability, including mechanisms to obviate conflicts of interest, especially in relation to commercial undertakings. Now, this is how MISTRA addresses this issue. And we believe that refinements in policy, in legislation, and praxis will help South Africa find the balance between the exercise of traditional leadership and the authority and sovereignty of the democratic state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the Executive Director for those opening remarks. I think indeed setting the scene very well. I'm going to move immediately to our next speaker, who has already been indicated is Deputy Minister Andries Nel, member of the Board of Governors of MISTRA, who is also a member of the National Assembly of South Africa. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Program Director, Dr. Sandy Africa, also the Executive Director of MISTRA, Mr. Joel Nchitenji, distinguished speakers, traditional leaders, and everyone on the platform. A very, very good morning. I think just to start by conveying a word of appreciation to the Executive Director and the staff of MISTRA for convening this very important and timely discussion on traditional leadership in South Africa's democratic constitution. Timely also because it coincides with a very momentous development in our history. And that is the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Constitution. The anniversary of the Constitution is appropriately being commemorated under the theme One Constitution, One Nation, Reflect, Renew, and Recommit. And I'm going to touch upon elements of that theme throughout the input that I've been asked to give. But before proceeding further, I would like to request all on the platform, wherever they may be joining us from, to join in reciting the preamble to the Constitution. of the Republic of South Africa. Maybe because we're on a virtual platform, we can close our mics as we do so. Otherwise, it tends to be a bit of a cacophony, unfortunately. We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We therefore, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic, so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Lay the foundations for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. Improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person, and build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. May God protect our people. Nkosi sikelele Afrika. Morena buluka sichaba sa Jesu. God sien South Africa. God bless South Africa. Mudzimu fatuchedza Africa. Osikatikisa Africa. Thank you. These words are not ceremonial rhetoric, because they define in a very real way both who we are, but also what we seek to become as a nation. And it is a practice which, as the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, we are encouraging all layers or spheres of government, all entities of the state, and society broadly to embrace as a recommitment to the core values and aspirations of the Constitution. The 30th anniversary invites us not merely to celebrate constitutional achievement, but also to engage in honest reflection, because we must ask whether 30 years after the adoption of our Constitution, how far are we in unifying the vision and the promise of the Constitution with the lived reality, the lived day-to-day reality of all citizens? Secondly, how well have we advanced those core constitutional values of respect for human dignity, human rights, and social cohesion? Also, how strong is the cohesion of our society? In other words, to what extent have we been able to build a united South African nation, united in our diversity? How resilient is our democracy? How trusted are our democratic institutions? And in that context, then also, what role can traditional leadership play in building social solidarity and democratic legitimacy? I think these questions are urgent because the evidence suggests, increasingly points to declining levels of social trust, social cohesion, and confidence in institutions. The Inclusive Societies Institute Social Cohesion Index points to significant strains in social cohesion and trust across South African society. Similarly, Afrobarometer findings show that while South Africans generally embrace diversity and tolerance, trust between citizens remains weak. Only minorities of respondents express trust in fellow South Africans, people from other ethnic groups, and people from other religions, and, might we say, people from other countries. I think an issue that is particularly relevant at the moment and which we shall also return to. I think this presents a profound challenge for nation building, because a constitutional democracy can't survive on formal institutions alone. It requires social trust, shared belonging, civic solidarity, and ethical leadership. Recent research also points to worrying trends in respect of our constitutional democracy. The Afrobarometer survey released in 2025 found that fewer than half of South Africans prefer democracy over other forms of government, while support for military rule has risen significantly to the highest level since this survey has been conducted. Also, the IEC voter participation survey highlights declining national pride, i.e. that people still identify and take pride in being South African, but that has declined significantly since the 2000s, the mid-2000s. Weakening trust in institutions and growing voter disengagement. In terms of trust in institutions, I think what's very significant is that the highest level of trust is enjoyed by religious leaders at about 59%. Traditional leaders come in at about, and the religious leaders coincide with the trust in the SABC, which is also at about 59%. So trust in traditional leaders is around 41%. There are other surveys, especially Afrobarometer, put it slightly lower at about 30%. Very concerningly, the trust in our courts is at 31%, and trust in political institutions such as Parliament and Parliament stands at 11%, and trust in politicians is at 9%. So I think all in all, there does seem to be a serious challenge with trust in our institutions. And I think the fact that traditional leaders are at 41%, one should be a worrying factor because it does represent a decline. On the other hand, it does pose the question why traditional leadership enjoys a higher level of trust than democratically elected leadership. And I think these findings should concern all who are committed to our constitutional democracy. Also, the Nglulamiti South African Scenarios 2035 project, in which MISTRA has played an important role, provides an important strategic lens through which to understand the constitutional and governance challenges confronting our democracy. The scenarios identify three key driving forces shaping South Africa's future: the risk of a prolonged low economic growth trap, state weakness and declining democratic accountability, and rising anger, distrust, and social fragmentation. The report warns that weakening institutional legitimacy, declining social cohesion, persistent inequality, and growing political alienation could deepen instability if left unaddressed. At the same time, the more optimistic Weaver Work scenario envisages a cooperative nation capable of rebuilding trust, strengthening institutions, and renewing social solidarity through ethical leadership, inclusive governance, and collective action. In this context, traditional leadership institutions, particularly in rural communities, may become increasingly important actors in fostering social cohesion, mediation, participatory development, and local legitimacy. But the scenarios also reinforce the constitutional imperative that all centers of authority must be grounded in accountability, inclusiveness, democratic participation, and respect for constitutional rights. The constitutional question before us is, therefore, remains not whether traditional leadership has a place in democratic South Africa, but how it contributes to building a society that is both constitutionally democratic and socially cohesive. Democracy cannot be sustained merely through periodic elections. It must deliver dignity, inclusion, justice, accountability, and responsive governance. All institutions, including Parliament, the executive, the judiciary, municipalities, political parties, civil society, and traditional leadership, carry responsibility for rebuilding public trust. Traditional leadership institutions, therefore, also face an important moment of reflection and renewal. The constitutional recognition of traditional leadership brings with it a range of constitutional responsibilities. The constitutional provisions dealing with traditional leadership are very carefully framed. Section 211(1) states that the institution, status, and role of traditional leadership according to customary law are recognized, subject to the Constitution. And I think that final phrase, subject to the Constitution, is critically important because it does affirm constitutional supremacy. Traditional leadership is recognized and respected, but within the framework of constitutional democracy and the law. Section 211(3) further requires courts to apply customary law when applicable, subject to the Constitution and legislation dealing specifically with customary law. I think this provision recognizes customary law as a legitimate source of South African law, not as a relic of the past, but as a living legal system capable of development in line with constitutional values. Section 212 provides that national legislation may provide a role for traditional leadership at local level on matters affecting local communities and may establish houses and councils of traditional leadership. I think these provisions reflect both recognition and transformation. The Constitution doesn't freeze customary systems in pre-colonial or apartheid forms, nor does it exempt them from constitutional scrutiny and accountability. Instead, it envisages an evolving relationship between democracy, accountability, customary governance, and constitutional rights. The constitutional inclusion of traditional leadership has always involved an inherent tension. Because democratic constitutionalism is founded on elected representation, accountability, openness, and equality, whereas traditional leadership systems are generally hereditary and historically rooted in customary authority. MISTRA's important publications on this subject engage directly with these complexities. As the executive director has indicated, and Dr. Africa has indicated, the MISTRA publication, Traditional Leaders in a Democracy, Resources, Respect, and Resistance, argues that the challenge is not traditional leaders as such, but the ways in which systems of authority were distorted by colonialism and apartheid, and how questions of legitimacy, accountability, and resource control continue to shape contemporary conflicts. Professor Lungisile Nsebeza, in MISTRA's working paper, Traditional Leadership in the Era of Multi-Party Democracy, points to the unresolved tension between unelected traditional authority and democratic representation. These are not just abstract academic debates because they concern in a very real way land, governance, accountability, participation, gender equality, community rights and development. And they also concern the daily lived realities of millions of rural South Africans. And at a time of declining social cohesion and declining trust in institutions, traditional leadership can potentially play either a constructive or a less constructive role in this regard. Traditional leaders often remain amongst the most immediate and accessible institutions in many communities. And the research that I referred to above indicate that indeed, in many instances, traditional leaders are approached both in the context of citizens seeking resolution to disputes through traditional law and traditional courts, as well as approaching traditional leaders on issues of development. And therefore, the potential of traditional leadership to contribute to social cohesion, conflict resolution, cultural continuity, and participatory development is very, very significant. I think it's therefore important that the constitutional project requires us to move away from false binaries. The question can't be traditional leadership or democracy. The challenge is how traditional leadership evolves within constitutional democracy, how we deepen democratic participation while respecting culture and identity, how we ensure that customary law develops consistently with equality and human dignity, and how do we strengthen both constitutionalism and social legitimacy. And I think as we reflect on 30 years of the constitution of constitutional democracy, we should always remember that the Constitution was never intended to be a static legal text. It is a living framework for transformation. And its endurance depends not only on courts and legislation, but on ethical conduct of leaders and active citizenship. The constitutional recognition of traditional leadership represents one of South Africa's most distinct democratic features. And I think that is a project that, as the executive director has indicated, is one that remains unfinished. There are, I think, very vibrant ongoing debates about the way in which the Constitution has framed the recognition and the role of traditional leaders. Very often, a contrast is drawn between the manner in which this is dealt with in the final constitution that was adopted in 1996 and how it was dealt with in the interim constitution of 1993, which gave a lot more detailed and expansive description of the recognition and the role of traditional leaders. And I think in the context of the activities such as the national dialogue, I think it is a debate that needs to and hopefully will be taken forward. So, Chairperson, as you activate your video, I take that as a signal that my time is up, and I was, in fact, going to say I thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Nel. And I think you've further just elaborated the conditions and the context in which this very important discussion is taking place. So sincerely thank you for your contribution as well. We are now going to move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi, who is the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And his remarks will be centered around the issue of traditional leadership, democracy and land, and with a sub-theme, constitutional silence and its consequences. Without further ado, over to you, Dr. Buthelezi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Africa, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to, in the few minutes that I have, really build on what Mr. Nchitenze and Mr. Nel have said. And I want to start by thanking MISTRA again for convening us for this important and timely conversation has been said. My remarks are going to, I think I'm going to also use as the jumping off point, the 2019 book that has been referenced here that MISTRA published. I was one of the editors of the book alongside Dinoa Skosana, who will speak later, as well as another colleague. And what I want to say really is that from 2019 until now, the picture has changed very little. What has been flagged, of course, is that there are new developments in the legislative space that are on the move currently, as well as the fact that, as has been said, there are debates that are being held and that need to be deepened. So with that frame, let me go back and perhaps just fill in some of the detail and build on what has been said about what has happened so far in the democratic dispensation, with some links, of course, to the longer past that I'll signal. Necessarily, what I'm going to say is going to be in some ways skeletal and a bit of a provocation in the interest of time. The point has been made that the place and role, and I'm using slightly different words, but the place and role of traditional leadership in the democratic dispensation, 30 years after the adoption of the Constitution, and we should also point out 32 years into our democratic dispensation, is something that's, I mean, the elaboration remains unfinished. It remains to be undertaken more deeply, and we've heard it's currently happening. The critical thing that is happening is that place and role of traditional leadership in this democratic dispensation remains very contested. In some ways, I think it is a specter that haunts the democracy building project that South Africa is undertaking. Of course, Mr. Nell has referenced in sections of the Constitution. In particular, he's referenced sections 211 and 212. That's chapter 12. Those are in chapter 12 of the Constitution. As has been said, and when I restate this in slightly different words, what that section of the Constitution does is it recognizes the institution of traditional leaders. But this is where, critically, the specter that I've referenced earlier really emanates from. There's a silence in that part of the Constitution on the roles, responsibilities, and resources that are due or can be extended to traditional authorities. What it does also, as has been said, is that that section of the Constitution subjects this recognition of traditional leaders to three things, actually. One is customary law. Two is the Constitution itself. And then thirdly, it is to legislation that may be passed. And I underline may in this instance because it doesn't guarantee that this elaboration of the role and of the place of traditional leaders and of what resources should be extended to traditional leaders by the state it doesn't guarantee that the legislation should follow. Hence, the point that Mr. Nechitenze made earlier, that at subnational level in particular, there remains a gap in elaborating the role of traditional leaders. But I'm going to focus at national level and also say that there's a gap there. That subjection, I think, of the to legislation of this recognition in that section of the Constitution, what it really did was it kicked the can down the road, meaning basically that this matter of the role, the responsibilities, the place, the resources for traditional leaders would be resolved by subsequent legislation. And of course, as we know from some of the scholarship around this, is that this emanates from fierce resistance to the entrenching of hereditary, unelected, predominantly male leadership in the democratic dispensation in the negotiation period in the transition to democracy. And this was done especially by women's groups. So the legislation that was meant to follow, to legislate the role, the powers, the resources of amakhosi, dikhoshi, inkosi, has repeatedly fallen into a pattern. Several pieces of legislation that were meant to do this elaboration have fallen into this pattern, and I'm going to outline it at a high level. Legislation gets introduced to Parliament. It is fought over quite fiercely often, with on one side groups representing traditional authorities demanding recognition and power. And often it is groups that are aligned to houses of traditional leaders or representing houses of traditional leaders, some individual royal families, as well as other groupings. Those groups have often been opposed by civil society groups representing communities, ordinary people, representing ordinary people representing themselves, of course, as well. And these have included, among others, public interest law groups and other NGOs. Often what then happens after this fierce contestation is that a version of the legislation that is being fought over eventually gets passed. Then the legislation gets challenged in court. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples in a moment. And often challenged all the way to the Constitutional Court. And almost without fail, the legislation has then been struck down by the Constitutional Court, being found to be inconsistent with the Constitution, as has been signaled earlier. Some of the examples, and I'll touch on them very briefly, include laws like the Communal Land Rights Act that was struck down by the Constitutional Court in 2010. And more recently, the law that has been really fiercely contested was the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act that was struck down in 2023, and in which Parliament was then given 2 years to enact improved legislation. That 2-year time horizon given by the court, of course, was not met, and that has now been further extended by another 2 years. Another case that was quite interesting, where there was a really fierce resistance, was the Traditional Courts Bill that was finally withdrawn after many years of being in the legislative pipeline and being fought over. It was eventually withdrawn in Parliament in 2014. Of course, it was then later revised, and it in fact then came back into the legislative process, and it was finally enacted in 2022. And it has not come into effect because there are some still unresolved issues around that law. Now, opposition to these laws has really been on the following, and again, I'm sketching this at a skeletal level. The opposition by civil society groupings, some of which I've been part of, have been associated with in the past, has been that a lot of these laws, in the ways that they've been enacted, lock people in rural areas. And the rural areas in South Africa, we should also point out, are largely formerly apartheid-era homelands. It locks people in these areas under the power and control of unelected, and in many cases, and the point has been made by Mr. Nell, that the leaders should be accountable. The argument has been that it locks people into structures that are unaccountable, where people do not have the choice of opting into the system or opting out if they want to. And in many instances, the opt-out option has never been available. If you happen to live in a particular geography, when this law is enacted, it locks you into being under the power of traditional leaders without the option of you choosing whether you want to be or not. And lastly, another point of contention has been that the laws give power to control land, in addition to controlling people, controlling land and other resources to these unaccountable leadership structures. The weaknesses, as Mr. Nchitenze has also pointed out, has been that the accountability mechanisms have been weak. And this is one of the things that, and of course, the democratic mechanisms, I should also say, especially in the traditional, Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act, that were there a little bit weak in the later law, the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act. The contention has been that they've been further weakened, in fact. The contention of scholars, of course, such as Mahmoud Mamdani, Lungisile Ntsebeza, Aninka Claessens, and others, has been that a lot of the source of this unaccountable power, in fact, is colonial and apartheid, not pre-colonial African forms of political leadership. And that's the longer past that we could get into. I want to end off by then saying, of course, on the other side, as Mr. Nchitenze has indicated, many of the traditional leaders, and they quoted some of the contributions to the 2019 book, say their legitimacy derives from pre-colonial African practice, i.e. custom, rather than that they should not then be subjected to the constitution. And ultimately, as this wrangling, as this contestation goes on, what has been happening, I think, on the ground, and Dinao's work shows this, is that there's been ongoing elaboration without the law, without policy keeping up with this elaboration, where actually real life practice, as Mr. Chitenze signaled, has been that there is an elaboration of how traditional authorities exercise power over land and over people. In many places, we see this in the form of the unlawful selling of land, in the denial of access to land to certain categories of people, including women, to the charging of levies on communal and ancestral land, such as the case was the case with the Ingonyama Trust, in a case that recently had been brought before a court in KwaZulu-Natal. And this has real consequences for people on the ground. Real consequences that I'm hoping Dineo will then elaborate a little bit on. Thank you very much, Chair. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buthelezi, and I'm sure we'll be returning to some of these themes. I must just remark that, we have been hearing from all the speakers about the contestations, the complications, the ambiguities, the unfinished business that there is. And we really hope that this contribution will, this webinar will make its contribution to debate and discussion on what ought to be the role of traditional leaders in a democracy. And so with that, it's just appropriate that we turn to our next speaker. Slight change of order. We're going to have Professor Sumadoda Figeni, who is the chairperson of the Public Service Commission, speaking next. And I invite Professor Figeni to address us on the question of the challenges faced by traditional leaders in our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director Dr. Sandy Africa, to the Mapungubwe Institute. I am relieved that many of the issues I would have started with have been raised quite clinically by Mr. Nechitenze, Dr. Mbongiseni, as well as Deputy Minister Nel. Suffice to say, maybe it helps to declare upfront, I come from a traditional rulership family, and I had been involved in many of the research work, including research support for the writing of the Constitution, wherein very elaborate, as Deputy Minister Nel indicated, submissions ended up mysteriously in 2 paragraphs of Chapter 12, no more other elaboration. Maybe one has to preempt a few things that I will highlight as the challenges facing traditional leadership by saying that let's admit at the time of transition, there was a great deal of contestation as to whether traditional leadership should be accommodated or not accommodated. The very tentative reference in Chapter 12 of the Constitution sometimes reveal the aspect of some people who felt this is a feudalistic relic of the past. It's a transient state, it may disappear. Some institutions, I remember even the Communist Party, were deadly against the very inclusion. Of course, at that point, the conflict, the tensions, the effort to accommodate, and what South Africa has not been able to deal with is How do you reconcile modernity and tradition, as you see in China, in India, in many other institutions in the Middle East and so forth? Because the binary treatment of the two, it's what has led to some of the challenges. I will elaborate on some of that. To start with, the statistics revealed by Deputy Minister Nel, it's more profoundly revealing than anything. What we say are democratic institutions very often have not been democratic institutions. The failure at local government level, at ward council level, is the one that has resuscitated some of the primordial institutions because they seem to perform better, or they become a place of retreat for some of the people. When you have a country that has become the most unequal in the planet Earth under a very progressive constitution, it's precisely because our focus in the first chapter of our constitution tend to be on the first generation human rights, the rights of communication, the rights of this and that, and very little focus on the substantive second generation human rights from land and many other things that you are talking about. In countries such as your Uganda, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, even Eastern Europe, some of these traditional leadership institutions were banished for a certain considerable period. But somehow, when institutions of democracy failed, people retreated to these primordial institutions as the last line of resort. Take traditional courts, for example. You'll find that if a neighbor's goats have been stolen or pigs have gotten into the neighbor's place, to go into a modern court, you would have to get a lawyer, pay so much money. Access to justice is a very expensive exercise in this country. Just to write or even transfer property can be 25,000 rands. And we're not recognizing these aspects of our democracy, which makes the realization of our progressive constitution real. At a real level, you see more performative democracy rather than substantive democracy. That's why then people go back into these traditional systems. That participation level, as the Afrobarometer, the HSRC, and many other studies have shown, in what is supposed to be democratic institutions, is an indication that at a substantive level, our democracy has not performed as it should. Hence, people retreat back to these. So when we say democratically elected or democratic institutions, we should realize that on paper, that is what it is, but substantively, it is not. Now, let me go into just quick, indication of these. The exclusion of the Khoisan was one of the weaknesses, which is being corrected. The issue of the Constitution being vague and very tentative in saying may, instead of elaborating what the role of traditional leadership was a clear signal that this was seen more as a burden that should be accommodated rather than an institution that should be worked on, integrated into the current system, and recognize the dual authority that you find in many of the rural areas. If you look at the national statistics in terms of the poverty indicators, in terms of people at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder of our society, they come from these very areas which are rural. Not because they come from traditional leadership, but they come from places where development has failed, where even the municipalities in those places, the ward councillors and so forth, have failed to perform. Hence, then you'd find people saying maybe the system we had, or primordially, let's retreat back to mobilizing ourselves around these. So we shouldn't then be saying to people, do you choose traditional leadership or the modern systems, when even the modern system has failed? Instead, we should be saying, how do we make these work such that you do have development in the places? In many of these rural, communities, you'll find that the chief and his councillors have control over land. Municipalities have been given power to provide services, but in most instances, they cannot be able to provide such services because the land is in the hands of traditional leaders. And the legislation simply says you may have 10% representation of traditional leadership, and most of the time that system has not worked. The other one, traditional leaders are an institution that is there, but schools for traditional leadership were closed. So when people get into succession, all they get is that leopard skin, no skilling, no induction, nothing. And we begin to say, this one is cutting land everywhere, giving everybody the land which was supposed to be for development. Those schools were the ones which were providing land management training on heritage, how to protect your culture and heritage and so forth. But in the absence of that, and in some of these traditional communities, you find that even where government was supposed to provide a secretary to support the traditional council, 2 years pass without anyone being provided there. As for the kings, the uneven treatment of kings across the country, where you find that it looks like there is a rank order, some are more senior than the others, some are provided and so forth. And many had said, no, it's because in some instances the province provides, but that's actually, when we investigate it, is not always the case. There are certain things such as your hospital treatment, such as your security, the employment of staff and so forth, which are supposed to be standardized nationally, some given the official passports and others not. That unevenness creates the fragmentation in terms of the social cohesion project. But even where you find, for example, in the case of Isilo, the king of AmaZulu, we are told there is a payment of 37 million and so forth. I had a meeting more recently, with His Majesty, and this was raised even by his father, the late King Zwelithini, to say, these monies they are talking about, we wish we could have a say over them. We wish we would know where that money goes, because it's controlled by the office of the Premier or the officials in Department A and B and C. And they never even consult, but when the media reports, the image and the damage comes to us. Similarly, a very pointed question on the Ingonyama Trust, where he said, we hear there are trustees who are appointed and so forth, and we have never been approached to have an input so that we make this thing people-centered and so on. Then I said, but the reports and the indications are that you have a direct control, or you might even... So some of these nuances create the challenges that we see right across. But because very often we tend to have a broad brush paint of what happens on the ground. For example, the issue of women and land in the rural areas. I often had people saying women are denied the piece of land, which could be the case in many other instances one cannot deny. From the time I grew up, it was understood that if you are a single woman and you have children, you are given a piece of land that belongs to you. But if you are a man and you are not married, you would struggle to be given that piece, because they would say, until you get married. But then when you get one single line which says, women are not allowed to have a piece of land. And that piece of land in some of these areas, that woman will bequeath that to her children, to her heritage, and so forth. Even the issues of land claims, when those come, they say, who are the children, even the ones who are married? But most of the time, research will say women out of the space, instead of saying, in area 1, this is what we found. In area 2, this is what we found. And most of the time now, the issue of women in the councils and even women who are regents, the numbers have gone up. So most of the time you find that the institution of traditional leadership suffers from this broad paintbrush of saying this is what it is without nuances of what in place A, in place B, in place C is taking place. It is not surprising, though, in a society where your hegemonic institutions are mainly modern and Western, because this translates even to the issue of language, the issue of culture, heritage, and so forth. Those have been the most forgotten institutions. Hence, they get challenged. Just what is there in the Constitution to say you can provide languages, indigenous languages in our schools? It does not get implemented. It's a right written there in the Constitution. Because generally take the basket of indigeneity and the institutions and the cultures and the heritage, they have never received the priority in the country. And you would have to understand the very, hegemonic nature of power and the counter-hegemonic struggles which are taking place. So, just quickly, the last two ones. Again, the assumption that I see the program director has shown up, the assumption that because there has been a word invoked, elections, that becomes democratic for the ward councillors. You know, people within parties, they create words which they disband thereafter. There's no democracy in that particular process. So to me, I would say, as we recognize the duality of these authorities at local government level, let's understand that the elected officials have failed dramatically, even though they carry the word elected. Most of the time, you'll find that 15% of people have even participated. Ward council meetings are not inclusive. Then you go to traditional councils and find that there you find broader representation of people participating. But because it has the tag tradition, we start thinking it's undemocratic. Then once you say elected, we think it is democratic. That's the point that we have to start literally investigating, because rural areas have been on a decline on all poverty indicators, investment indicators, because we have this notion of this performative democracy, which at a substantive level is not there. So the binary comparison of the two should not be an issue. We should look at the bigger picture. I think things like district development models are also the things that have actually failed. If you were to say we depend on courts, the modern courts, only the rich will make it to that. Because even signing a letter, you go to a lawyer, you have written your letter. The lawyer simply put whereas and charge you 6,000 rands. In a community, you just go there, a meeting is arranged in a traditional community, and you try to solve these things. Until we deal with the schizophrenic personality on how we approach indigenous issues, we will not move far. China, India, and many others are demonstrating that you can modernize and still retrieve your history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. And I think you're going back to the point that the executive director started off with when he pointed out that other societies have managed to manage these tensions. But thank you also for unpacking very clearly what needs to be changed and fixed, and how this can potentially happen in order to overcome some of these, I suppose, biases and in a way, failures to actually give full expression to our constitutional provisions. So with that, I'd like to thank you and acknowledge that at some point you may have to slip out of the meeting. But I want to also point out that there have been lots of wonderful contributions in the chat, questions as well as comments, and please take note of them. We'll also be giving the speakers, the panel of speakers, an opportunity to engage with some of them after we've had our last panelist speaking today. Our panelist then is Dr. Dineo Skosana, who is the head of the Society Work and Politics Institute, SWAP, a research institute at the University of the Witwatersrand, and also a senior lecturer at the university in the Political Studies Department. And she'll be addressing us on the question of the lived realities of people, the community power, human rights, and accountability in rural South Africa as sub-themes of what she'll address us on. Over to you, Dr. Skosana.
Thank you, Dr. Sandy, and also to reiterate Winnie's words, to thank MISTRA for convening us and for your consistent commitment to this intellectual project. I've now worked with mining affected communities for over 17 years. And I wanted to share some of the accounts that come out of these communities, particularly communities that experience mining-induced dispossession. So those that are relocated because of mining, different kinds of minerals in South Africa. And so this comes out of some of our projects and some of my work that I've done over the years. And these are some of the codes. And so the surnames of the families are pseudo surnames. One of the families that I encountered said to me they had faced relocation. So both the relocation of the homesteads, some their ancestral graves as well because of mining. And coal in this case, and I will speak specifically on KZN and other parts of land that is under customary governance in South Africa. And one family, Babuginda, said, the contract was in English. I will show you. No one took us through it. In fact, you had to sign immediately, and you can tell that there's a template for all the contracts. These are all the same and not tailored to people's assets. This is the contract for sugarcane he gave me. This was my father's compensation. This one was mine. This was not a negotiation. We were given the figure that you can't dispute or decline. This money is little. From it, you must hire a truck, relocate, rebuild your house, and relocate your graves. I refused to have our ancestral graves relocated because these are 22 ancestral graves. They promised to give us 6,000 for a cow and 400 for a goat for all of the graves, and I refused. And so here Ubabuginda was sharing that and showing me his contract of 640,000, which in that amount included the sugarcane farm that they owned over years, the relocation of the homestead and the loss of land, and the compensation for the ancestral graves, which he refused that they be relocated. And one more account. Umam Kapiwa said, at first they said we were not going to be relocated. To my surprise, later on, I saw boys erecting a mine fence inside my yard. When I said, but I thought the mine will not affect me, they said, this is an instruction from the mine. The mines boys then said, the next time they came, sorry ma, we need to remove you and the house. They had a tractor. Ngakhala sisi, ngakhala ngaza ngathula bayidiliza. Meaning I cried and cried until I kept quiet as they demolished. So She watched her own home being demolished because of coal mining. And in this particular case, the culprit is Tendele Mine. And of course, these are common accounts. You don't just find this in coal-mined areas. You also find these accounts in chrome-mined areas, platinum-mined areas in the Waterberg area as well. Now, I also want to share that some of the lived realities in the post-apartheid era for these communities, and just to give you a little bit of the profile, 17 to 20 million people, and this is about 30 to 35% of the country's population, live on customary land that is under the authority of chiefs. And the question is, what does it mean to live on customary land? Now, these are communities who are protected by the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act of 1996. And so obviously they hold informal land rights. And so the Act recognizes three types of rights, which is occupation, use, and access. And having informal land rights means that these communities do not have or possess a title deed. And so there's a problem of security of tenure there, which I'll speak to. But what then throws another complexity to the lived experiences of communities is that the homelands, the former homelands, have been found to be minerally rich, and the exploitation thereof, so the exploitation of these minerals, is provided by the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002, what is known as the MPRDA. Now, the MPRDA vests the minerals of the country in the hands of the state as the custodian, right? So it's complex in that what is underneath is administered by the state, the minerals. Now, the communities have the rights of occupation or surface rights to live on the land, but equally there's corporate interest, which means that mining companies can apply for a prospecting permit and therefore a mining right at the end, and competing with the rights to occupation with communities. Now, to complicate the lived realities even more is that, as we have spoken and as we've heard from the previous panelists, is that there is a dual governance system in South Africa, which is a democratic government and its structures, and you also have ubukhosi, or traditional authority, in this case. And so then what does it mean for capitalist interest? Obviously, is that you can apply and you can gain a permit. And so what's interesting then is that these complexities on how the different legislative frameworks, mind you, there's others, water, environment, heritage, which I've touched on ancestral graves. All of these intersect with the MPRDA, with IPILRA in very complex ways, and in complex ways that highlight, both different forms of governance that is traditional and that is democratic at the same time. And so what we have seen, at least and what I've highlighted in my work, is that, then particularly now with the boom for demand for minerals, and this has always been there, it's not that it's starting now, for example, with critical minerals, is that you have mining-induced dispossession, and that dispossession is an ongoing experience for communities. And so it didn't end in 1994. It's a perpetual experience for communities. And I've shown the meanings of land in my work. It's important to say that dispossession is not just the loss of land, it's also the loss of the intangible connections to the land, to ancestral graves, and so on and so forth. And so I write a lot about what I call spiritual dislocation or spiritual loss, which I found is quite difficult to compensate, particularly once communities have been relocated and so on and so forth. But I want to bring the subject of grave relocations, which is also my area of expertise. And I'm deliberate about why I'm bringing grave relocations and graves specifically, because in many cases in South Africa, when these are exhumed and reburied elsewhere, communities are offered what you call a wake fee. Now, it's not meant to be compensation. It's meant to assist with rituals and so on and so forth that are important as you relocate abantu baphansi or people's ancestors and so on. And so this has been kept generally at 1,005. Now, I don't know who came up with this figure. However, on customary land, and as you would have seen in cases such as Somkele and many others, the traditional authorities have agreed to amounts such as 8.5 for a cow and a goat for 1,005. And I mean, with cattle, I mean, depending on the type of cattle, it varies in price. And all of that is something that you would think traditional leaders would negotiate differently, knowing that kunenkomo mama, inkomo baba, so the cattle that you use to speak to ancestors that are directly related, let's say, to the head of the household, the wife, the children, those technicalities which differ. I mean, they are not homogeneous, they vary across communities. Now, what my work then highlights is that this violation, human rights violation, gross human rights violation, with the breaking of skeletons in cases of exhumation, indecent grave relocations, indecent reburials, with ancestral graves at times facing mine dumps, being relocated from homesteads and now being placed in public cemeteries, which evokes all kinds of questions intellectually, I think, but also spiritually for communities. But I've chosen this example around graves because they are protected by the National Heritage Act, right? And they are on the surface. So they share the place that communities also occupy because it's part of their identity, a site of connection, and so on and so forth. Now, what is interesting as well is that traditional leaders are recognized in the Heritage Act. And they are recognized by Chapter 12 of our Constitution as the custodians of culture, of heritage, and so on. And also under Customary Law, Chapter 8, again recognized. But then increasingly, as I've worked in this area and as I've interacted with colleagues across multiple institutions, LAC, PLUS, and the legal cases that have gone in court through LRC, Richard Spoor attorneys, lawyers for attorneys for climate and environmental rights, all rights. So all of these houses, CALs here at WITS as well. All of these cases that have gone to court and so on and so forth, which you see, for me then, and which raise serious human rights violations. But in this case, if we're speaking about ancestral graves, then I've wondered, what then is the role and the responsibility of traditional authority if they can allow on customary land the relocation of ancestors, of their history, of their lineage, of their tradition, and be compensated a wake fee of 1,005? Or inkomo eyedwa, where people have ancestral graves that are over 30, but you're given inkomo eyedwa with 8.5, and to say that is someone's mother, someone's grandfather, and you're relocating with that amount. What then is the role of traditional leaders in South Africa? And this is a question that has gotten me returning to this book that we worked on collectively with MISTRA, and Sandy spoke about. I'm about to finish. And this book, I mean, is very interesting. And when we were working with it with Mbongiseni, and now it's almost 7 years later, I'm realizing that there is a narrative that scholars have missed. And it's not that I'm sympathetic to traditional leaders. However, I mean, as an academic, your role is to present all other aspects of the argument, of the ideas, of concepts, and so on. And so what comes out strongly in this book, especially when you engage the work of Ubabu Patigile Olobisa, and even my own argument, is that traditional leaders were central, particularly after the making of the Union of South Africa in 1910. They were then central, really, in the formation of the ANC. Some, as Prof. Somadoda have said, come from these families of traditional authority. And therefore, equally, they were challenged in 1913 with that Land Act. And so you saw many of them challenging this, going to conventions in Europe and so on. But now the narrative that's missing in intellectual work, in academic work, is that traditional leaders too were dispossessed. So they too suffered dispossession with the native administration of colonialism and the Bantu authorities administration much later. And so then, and you see in the work that I've then done with Mbongiseni on traditional leadership disputes, and those disputes, which were investigated through the Traditional Leadership Governance Framework Act, highlighted that the institution really was set up, I'd say, to fail and to self-destruct, which is a serious problem. But now what has happened, and I'm closing, post-1994, is that with the Constitution, it then provides blanket recognition. And so I want to highlight strongly that there were traditional authorities that were handpicked, created, as Mamdani has argued, and Nzebeza has shown in his case of Kalanga. However, there were equally traditional leaders that fought for the liberation of this country. And then there were others who straddled both, playing both offices. But I also want to say that now when the Constitution gives recognition, they gave blanket recognition, including those who were puppets of the state, those who were handpicked and created where they didn't exist. Now that is the problem. And I remember after finishing rereading this book again to say then, what does it mean to then give blanket recognition to an institution that still needed to go a process of repair? And that still needed to go through a process of healing, reflection, and now it's being incorporated into a new democratic system. And in some ways, it's like this institution ought to refine itself in this new democratic dispensation. And I think these are questions that we have to fundamentally go back to in ways that are meaningful so that we can have rural citizens really enjoy the benefits of democracy and not be the zones of exclusion or the zones of sacrifice that our work has highlighted. So I will stop here. Thank you, Dr. Sandy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skosana. I think you've really brought to our attention that this is not a debate, this is not an issue that is about only the functional provision of water and the benefits that a democracy in general should bring, but it's about the actual existence of people, the spirituality, the identity, the being, not only of people that are here with us, but those who have gone before. I think you've also highlighted another important element, and that is not only is this a debate and discussion about the relationship between the state and the people, but also one about the people and capital, the people and their rights to livelihood. So these are very important questions. And we've come to the point where all our speakers have had an opportunity to just share their initial reflections. We will now then open up the discussion more broadly. As the program indicates, what we're going to do is bring into the discussion our moderator for this section of the program. What has been happening is that our moderator, Njabulo Zwane from MISTRA, has been noting the questions, and he has tried to order them, and we'll be throwing them back and highlighting some of the comments as well. And we'll then invite the speakers to reflect on them, to respond to the question, just so that we can have some engagement of what has been going through the minds of people who've come to share this day with us. So I introduce to you Njabulo Zwane. Over to you, Njabulo.
Thank you, Prof. Good morning, everyone. All protocols observed. I have been monitoring the discussion on both the Q&A sort of box and the chat box. The discussion has been very, very lively. So we've got quite a few comments and questions, but I'll just run through the first two in accordance to the themes that I've grouped them. I've grouped the questions in. So I've grouped these questions and comments into four themes. Let me quickly take you through the themes. I'm sorry I can't show my video. We tried doing the video earlier, but there's just something wrong with my side, technical issues on my side. So just to run through the themes that the questions that I've grouped the questions under. First one being the roles and powers of traditional leaders. Second one has to do with the uneven treatment of traditional leaders and the issue of Khoisan representation. The third theme has to do with rethinking the relationship between traditional leadership and modern democracy. And then the fourth theme is communal land rights. So when it comes to the issue of the roles and powers of traditional leaders, I'll just run through some questions, not all of them on this theme. The first question came from David Kenvin, who says, and I quote, "The problem with traditional leadership in South Africa, as someone who lives in the UK, is that it is not regional and not nationwide. King Misuzulu, for instance, has no influence in the Northern Cape and in provinces other than KwaZulu-Natal and possibly Gauteng. The same applies to the other traditional leaders outside their own provinces. They also do not have the same first languages, unlike the nobility in the UK. What can be done to resolve these issues and to bring traditional leadership into the upholding of democracy in South Africa and the constitution of your country?" He writes, and I quote, end quote. The second question, still on the issue of roles and powers of traditional leaders, came from Michael Khan, who asks, what does the panel have to say regarding Botswana's model of land boards, which is a democratic structure that includes dikgosi as members of the board? This mechanism sits alongside the recognition of traditional law and courts, end quote. So those are the questions on that theme. Moving on to the theme of the uneven treatment of traditional leaders and Khoisan representation. This is a long, and you'll note that I'm trying to read them out so that I don't misquote people. So this question came from Wandisi Lesebezo, who writes, and I quote, "In the South African context, traditional leaders often behave as though they're the authority and law unto themselves. From the late King Zwelithini to the current Abatembu King Dalindyebo, there seems to be a competition for influence and resources between traditional leaders and elected representatives in the form of councillors and MPs. The question is, are they honestly playing their role as custodians of culture, or are they just a burden to the state?" And Wandisile goes on to say, also, how do we reconcile the inequality amongst them, noting that government seems to pay too much attention to the Zulu monarch and very little to the other monarchs? This then creates a certain perception about whether government really values the role of traditional leaders or is just using them for their buy-in for their respective constituencies, end quote. Oryx Swartboy asks, is there resistance from any formation to full and fair recognition of the First Nations peoples, like the Khoi and San traditional leaders? Is it merely perception or is it political? Then our third theme is the one on rethinking this relationship between...
Excuse me. I don't want us to lose our panelists. So I'm wondering, Njabulo, whether we can't pause here and give each panelist perhaps a few minutes to respond to one or two of those questions before we move on to the next two themes. I think, if you don't mind, we'll do it that way. Okay. So can I invite the panelists, Dr. Buthelezi, Dr. Skosana, if either of you would like to respond, or in fact, even our who opened the Deputy Minister Nell and Mr. Netshitenzhe, you're also welcome if you'd like to respond to any of those. I think they're also very deeply reflective questions in any case, and stand in a way also as commentaries and very rich contributions.
Dr. Africa, if I may, I'm going to be brief and try and respond to a bundle of questions simultaneously. So I think one of the challenges that we face in South Africa is that we've got to a place where the discussions have become polarized. And so if around any piece of legislation, as I signaled earlier, there's often such contestation because people are coming with entrenched positions. So what we've not been able to do yet, and I think there's a comment, one of the comments that have just come in is it says it's time for new kids on the block to take the conversation forward. I think that's part of what we need to try and find ways to do, where we create discussion platforms that can open the conversation anew. The new conversation that needs to be had for me really needs to take seriously some of the provocations that we've heard from Professor Figeni, from Dr. Skosana, that we've gone down paths that are locking us into thinking in these binary ways, where we think that anything that has to do with traditional authorities should be dismissed out of hand because it is undemocratic, etc. And that democracy means elections, but what we see behind that is that participation is declining, as was said, but also that the institutions that we've tried to build in the democratic era are themselves not delivering the better life that we want for everybody in South Africa. And so we need a new conversation. And that conversation, to me, what it also needs to do is it needs to get out of or rather, it needs to be curated differently to how we've seen, say, Parliament try and curate conversations when it comes to what is so-called public participation. Public participation has become a kind of exhibitionist space in which people come in and shout at one another, and there's no genuine conversation, there's no genuine negotiation around how do we solve the real problems that we're facing. And so that's really where organizations like the one I work for, the Nelson Mandela Foundation, are really trying to find a way for us to find new ways of talking to one another, to negotiate towards resolving these questions genuinely, rather than simply shouting at one another across divides. I think that's really, for me, one of the fundamental things that we need to find a way of doing anew. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Skosana, would you like to respond to anything at this stage?
Yeah, just briefly, some of them really are deep reflections and some which we still grapple with, but just 2 points, particularly around, I think it's Kevin who speaks about the roles and powers of traditional authority, particularly outside provinces. And I beg to differ, Kevin. I think when we think about traditional authority and democracy in very binary terms, in the way that, in fact, I think Mbuyiseni is reflecting, including Prof. Figeni talking about modern and democratic. We speak about these almost as if they never blend, they never intersect. And I think the issue here is that they do. So the urban as well as the rural actually intersect and blend in ways that are very complex. And we've seen in the outcomes of both local and national elections. right? And so I think it's been careless of our state to often categorize the rural as there, of course, forgotten at times or remembered during elections, and the urban is there, and as if those who live in urban spaces never engage with home, where the rural is. And it's an understanding that we have that movement, and South Africa has a long history of that movement. Then that I think we also think more creatively, and we would, about this system when we I think strip down these dichotomies, urban, rural, because also then we don't say that we've got traditional courts for the rural and we've got modern courts, those who can afford, those that can't. We have to understand that society is more complex than that. And I think that's why we're having this gathering, to try and think about, can these two systems actually be blended in ways that are very functional and deliver democratic lived experiences, whatever that might look like, in rural areas. And so I do think the picture is more complex than that. And then my last point, really, on land boards and what you see in Botswana, I think it's an interesting model. And I'd like to say in South Africa, for me, it would be interesting because it's comparative with the idea of communal trust in South Africa, for example. But my question, which I'm a little skeptical about, is that with land boards, similar to communal trusts, there's been questions about who sits in these boards, who sits in the communal trusts, which, for example, have come through, provided for by the MPRDA on social labor plans. Now, the issue is that you have traditional authorities, again, who sit on the communal trusts. And so, and at times then the funds that are gained from mining companies giving a portion of their revenue towards these trusts is not trickled down to communities. And so there is an issue here of that if these boards or trusts do not reflect the communities, are not inclusive of the interest of communities, then it's better really not to have these. And I think it would be interesting to think about, how do we remodel participation, particularly in ways that can speak to the rural aspects of communities. So yeah, that's just one thing that I wanted to highlight as far as that, to say, I mean, it would be interesting to toy around with the idea, but we haven't quite figured out this issue around communal trust. And so for me, then it says, can we figure out a land board system if we haven't figured out the other model? So yeah, it's an interesting question and one to think about a little bit more.
Thank you. With my eye on the clock, I wonder if we shouldn't then go on to the next two sets of questions. So if you'll come in again, Njabulo, and tell us what others have contributed. Thank you.
Oh. And actually, the next two themes, the first theme has to do with the issue that Dr. Skhosana was just talking about now, this relationship between traditional leadership and modern democracy, and having to rethink our assumptions about that relationship. So this comment comes from Lesedi Mutsatsi, who writes, and I quote, "The question should be, how do we shape the South African Constitution to conform to African values?" He goes on to say that the issue seems to be that the institution of traditional leadership is inherently undemocratic. This notion is false and needs to be unchallenged. Instead, MISTRA should be looking at the system of representation for South Africans in government. The electoral system is essentially undemocratic, end quote. And then the next comment, still on that theme, or a question actually, comes from Ngamsile Ngubane, who writes, and I quote, "Who benefits from us not treating the current challenges facing the institution of Ubukhosi, such as lack of accountability, as the result of the disruption of colonization, and not as an inherent failure of the institution of Ubukhosi?" So I'll just end on that so that I can take this this question having to do with the last theme on communal land rights. And it comes from Sibabalwe Samla, and who writes, and I quote, "In our effort to attract foreign direct investment and transform our villages into thriving economies, we face a critical legal bottleneck. Who holds the definitive bankable title to communal land? Is it the rural resident allocated the plot by a traditional leader, the traditional authority acting as custodian, or the external investor seeking commercial security? Without clear land tenure, how do we protect community rights while giving investors the legal certainty they require?" End quote. Yeah, so I'll end there and then maybe we can come back again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, to a very interesting set of questions again. Can I invite our speakers to respond? I think it was a very interesting question, whether it's the Constitution that should actually align with values of the people. And I think a very legitimate question: who's benefiting from the fact that these issues after 30 years remain unresolved? Are they in fact unresolved? Perhaps there are those who would say that, well, there's been some progress here or there. Thank you. Thank you.
So I think that the question of whether we should rethink some of what is in the Constitution, I think that's a fair point. That if we've put in place things that are not working for the society, the kind of society that we are, and for the aspirations of the majority, for our aspiration for the society we want to become. Those things should not be holy cows. They should be open to question and to rethinking. Now, the rethinking, of course, I think there's some fundamental things that are in our Constitution where I think we should draw the line. Where Deputy Minister Nell began with reading and asking us to recite the preamble of the Constitution. The aspirations expressed there to me are quite compelling, and in many ways, I think they are a sort of gold standard for the kind of society that we should aspire to become. However, as has been said in this webinar, if aspirations do not match lived reality, and if the evolution of the society is not going in a way that matches those aspirations, we need to be able to rethink, to recalibrate, and to open up things like the Constitution and the law to a rethink and rewriting. However, I think what we also need to be very careful about is when the Constitution gets challenged often. It is from very sort of particular interests that are not always progressive and that are not going to move us towards the democratic ideals that are articulated in that preamble. And so we also need to be careful that we're not allowing ourselves to be seduced by undemocratic and regressive elements that are not going to take us towards a society in which we are able to live harmoniously, that are in fact driving particularist agendas that are going to benefit others at the expense of the majority. And so for me, really, the long and short of it is that in all of this, the question of renegotiating, the question of rethinking what we've put in place, how it has evolved, and being able to pause and take quite seriously the provocations and the problems that have been pointed out about what we've been trying to do in South Africa. The problem that I come back to is that we're not having we're not able to have honest enough conversations, that are also open enough to be able to accommodate the very real contestations that also need to be part of the conversation. We quickly rush to try and jump over the problems, or even the proper diagnosis of what the problems are, to get to solutions, and the solutions themselves are going to lead us to further problems. So I really think I land on this point of, we need to be able to open up the conversation again and have the conversation honestly, be able to look one another in the eye and be critical of one another, and be able to be honest about the problems that have arisen from what we've been trying to achieve, and how then we recalibrate towards achieving the ideals that are articulated so beautifully and so compellingly in the Constitution.
Thank you very much. Dr. Skosana, anything that you'd like to reflect on?
Yes, just a few points as well. I mean, I was just thinking, if we cannot rethink, for example, aspects of the Constitution, we could rethink aspects of the law. For example, I was trying to remember which sections in the MPRDA speaks about consultations, for example. And I was thinking, in my own work, I've said, for example, there is a need to perhaps re-articulate certain things, such as a consultation, shifting it perhaps to a negotiation, and understanding what a negotiation then does, which is to actually open up a meaningful dialogue between stakeholders. Here, this would be traditional authorities, communities, the state, and the mining company. I'd say a negotiation recognizes that there's a possibility that the community can actually say no, and there's a need to actually respect that if they say they don't want mining. And it also gives a particular power, I'd say, in this hierarchical consultation to communities. And so there are sections that we can maybe sharpen or tighten a little bit more, so that we can have a traditional authority system that doesn't actually bypass the section and doesn't treat it as a bureaucratic exercise. So that is that. I think it's section 10, and I think 16, if I remember. With the Heritage Act, section 36, it should be included that grave relocations shouldn't happen at all, particularly for minerals, because now we're shifting into critical minerals, which means that there's going to be a demand for more land. And why is it that when there's a demand for land, we can go to that which is occupied by African people? And I think that is a problem, which means, again, you can intervene legislatively to say you do not touch ancestral graves at no point. I also think, communities have articulated this working with other partner organizations that we work with as SWAP, which is LAC Plus, and they've said that we need to formalize IPILRA, so the Informal Land Rights Act, and think about what the formalization actually means for communities. And there's been work that has been done even by others that we've worked with. Aninka Claessens as well has done wonderful work and arguing that IPILRA, which is the Informal Land Rights Act as it exists now, always have to be read together with the MPRDA. And we saw with the Bakatla, Bakafela, and that court ruling. And so why is it that we have one moment of celebration when there is that, there is a court ruling that sets the landscape, but then we forget again and retreat to our old ways. And so I do think there's certain interventions that we can make, at least maybe legislatively, if we're struggling with the constitutional aspects that Mboniseni has highlighted.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Skosana. I wonder if our Board of Governors member, Mr. Nell, would like to come in and just reflect on some of the questions or issues that have been raised.
Thank you very much, and thank you very, very much both to all of my fellow panelists and the very, very rich body of questions and interventions on the chat group. Mine, just a very few remarks. The first is I want to start with a question about what can be done to, or what should be done to align the Constitution with African values. Now, the supposition or the assumption in that underlying that question is that the Constitution is not based on African values. And I think that's an assumption that needs interrogation, and I think quite critical, strenuous integration or interrogation, because I do think that the Constitution is in a very, very real way premised on African values. African values that have a very long history stretching back to the formation of the ANC, the adoption of an African Bill of Rights, the African Claims document in the 1940s, the Freedom Charter of the 1950s, and then in the process leading up to the Constitution, I mean, a very, very extensive process of consultation and engagement. And the constitution-making process itself, which I was very privileged to have been part of, I mean, engaged in very, very extensive direct consultation and the receipt of many, many, many thousands of submissions. So it's not, I think my concern with the way in which the question is formulated is that it almost implies that the Constitution is an external or exogenous product that has been imported or imposed from somewhere, and not a homegrown indigenous product. And I think I was actually going to quote from former President Mbeki's celebrated "I'm an African" speech, which was delivered on the 8th of May, 1996, on the occasion of the adoption of the Constitution. And I think there's no accident that that speech is known as "I am an African." So I think that is a dialogue that we need to, or a conversation that we need to engage in further. My second point would be that I think these are very real issues that we need to reflect on as we celebrate 30 years of the Constitution. And as I said in my initial input, a constitution by its nature is not cast in stone. Yes, it is meant to be a document that enjoys some permanence and stability, but it certainly is not immutable. But as we engage in that, I think it's also important to be clear on what our fundamental point of departure and world outlook is. Any institution is by its very nature a dynamic institution. It impacts upon society, and society impacts upon it. Any institution, tradition, or culture that claims to be static and immutable is being done so for a reason and in the interests of someone, because that is not how reality works. And therefore, I think to craft, as has happened here, a distinction between traditional leadership on the one hand and so-called modern democracy on the other. The reality is that both traditional leadership and so-called modern democracy have all gone very fundamental processes of development, evolution, and ongoing change. And I think it's that dynamic aspect of both that we need to focus on and say how, in an ever-changing world, and changing institutions, values, and traditions, how do we guide and steer that ongoing evolution, both of tradition as well as our constitutional democracy? Lastly, I think we must never forget that that process of ongoing evolution takes place within the context of a very concrete material and economic environment. And I think many of the challenges that beset our democratic institutions, challenges of capture, of corruption, are fueled also by the existing model of economic accumulation that is prevalent in our society. And I think, regrettably, the evidence points more and more and more that traditional leadership is also not immune from the challenges posed by our existing form of economic accumulation. So as we discuss those things, I think we must resist the temptation of discussing them as if they are abstract entities that float in the air without change, without any connection to the very real socio-economic dynamics and interests within society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nel. And that actually brings us to the end of the time we have allocated for this part of the program. Thank you to Njabulo Zwane for curating the questions, and to everyone who's contributed. We haven't been able to get round to all the individual comments. I want to mention that MISTRA has decided that the book to which we've been referring throughout, the book on traditional leaders in a democracy, is going to be available as an open access publication. So please look out for it. And use it to take the debate and discussion further. So I believe that Prof. Fikeni has his hand up, and I want to invite him to make his final remarks, and immediately thereafter I will be calling upon the Executive Director of MISTRA, Mr. Joel Nechitenze, to close the proceedings for us. But from my side, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Program Director. I just wanted to say two things. One, how is it possible that we could exercise fully what our Constitution promises if you have such levels of inequality that those who have the means are able to exploit and give meaning to the Constitution, mobilize, have resources, to a point where you find that some of the entities that never believed in the Constitution are the ones which are now benefiting better. And also, our crafting of the democracy might just need us to embrace the complexities, as Dr. Skosana was saying and Dr. Buthelezi, instead of looking at which institution, if you isolate traditional leadership alone, because you might just be having the failure of both the elected systems as well as the traditional leadership, and then ask what is the issue at hand. And in that way, we will not be chasing the decoy that this or that institution is the cause, but rather go to the very fundamentals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Fikeni. And with that, I would like to hand over to the Executive Director to do the closure. And as I do so, I must acknowledge everyone who made this webinar possible, the organizers, 2807, our promotions and media company that works with us, the staff of MISTRA, and of course the donors who make all of MISTRA's work possible. Executive Director, over to you for the closure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. You have already done the closure. So you have tempted me to perhaps highlight a few provocations for further reflection as we take this matter forward. One of them, in my own mind, is the fundamental question that we need to resolve of whether we do agree or do not agree that liberal democracy is, in a sense, an achievement of human civilization. And it would be incorrect to characterize it as European, foreign, African, or this or the other. And especially with regard to South Africa, the inclusion of progressive generations of rights in our constitution, gender, social, economic, informational, and otherwise, and what the Deputy Minister has said about how the constitution was adopted. All those things make the South African constitution genuinely South African. And so as we face these challenges of how to deal with various manifestations of governance, including traditional leadership, the question is whether, if there are weaknesses in electoral democracy, we should be seeking to replace or degrade electoral democracy rather than thinking about how to improve its quality, how to improve its leadership, how to improve accountability. The other issue is about being consistent in implementing the legislation that we adopt. Because as one said earlier, there are generic laws about traditional leadership, but there were certain things that were meant to be done at subnational level, subsidiary legislation or regulations, which things were not done and therefore left a vacuum. Then there is the matter that I think has arisen during the course of discussion and which one had tried to refer to in the introduction, characterizing it as bi-directional osmosis. How do you ensure that traditional leaders find some form of representation or some form of involvement in relation to elected institutions? You have these at national and provincial level in the form of the various houses, but how does this manifest at local level? Should traditional leaders have some role in advising municipalities, and should this be formalized? And should councillors or their representatives have a role in the traditional council? And the instance that has been quoted of the Botswana-led body is an interesting one that needs to be looked at. And Professor Fikeni's observation about training and induction of traditional leaders, I think it's also a very profound one that needs to be looked at. All elected representatives do undergo some form of induction. Why shouldn't the same apply to traditional leaders? And that training, in my view, would then also include matters of ethics, because amongst the major challenges that we face in many areas would be traditional leaders involved in commercial undertakings using their absolute monarchical authority. And how do we deal with that kind of challenge? I should conclude by saying that there was an issue that one of our partners communicated because he could not be present in the discussion. And this is the matter of the current discourse that we're having in the country about migration, and whether there is a role that traditional leaders can play. And I think all of us would agree that traditional leaders have got an important role to play, amongst others, because in addition to the overall authority that they have in the rural communities, they also play a role in allocating land as to who settles where. They also have a role in ensuring that there is regulation about who rents out spaces for shops and so on. And they also have a role in ensuring observance by communities of the settlement of irregular or illegal migrants in these communities. All this cannot happen without traditional leaders becoming aware of it. And as to whether there are instances where some of them may be surreptitiously involved in allowing these things to happen and then later complaining about them, it's an issue that needs to be looked at. And one needs to emphasize we're talking here about irregular or illegal migration and not people who are here in accordance with our laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair and Edie. And with that, we bring the webinar to a close. And if you want to watch the proceedings again, it will be available. And we wish you well. Thank you for attending. Thank you to the speakers as well.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.